Hello, welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. The weaponisation of anti-Semitism to close down criticism of Israel is nothing new. I mean, the former Israeli minister Shlomo Aloni described it as a trick that they always use, and it's even being used today to suppress opposition to the genocide in Gaza. Now, one of the country's leading critics of Israel is David Miller, who lost his job as a sociology professor at Bristol University when he was sacked for his critique of Zionism. And I'm pleased to welcome David onto this edition of Resistance TV. How are you, David? Good to see you, mate.
Very well, thank you.
Very good. Well, let's start then. Just before we talk about your appeal, because I know you've appealed against your dismissal, which was a couple of years ago now, wasn't it? But before we talk about that, I wonder whether you could just tell us about it was a vituperative campaign, wasn't it, that was waged against you by the Zionist lobby. Just talk us through that, will you, first?
Well, I mean, I suppose the campaign against me goes back more than a decade, really. The first time I was ever described as an anti-Semite by the lobby was back in about 2010, 2011, when I'd been doing research on the neoconservative movement and its role in the Iraq War and afterwards. And I was described as an anti-Semite then. One of the earliest occasions was I was described by a guy called Shiraz Maher, who used to work for the International Centre for Political Violence and Radicalisation at King's College, and at that stage had worked for the Policy Exchange and various other neoconservative think tanks. And he referred to me as hosting an anti-Semite. So by implication, I must be an anti-Semite because I had an anti-Semite stay at my house. And what he was referring to there was that there was a guy called Joel Covell, who I met, was friends with, and I was hosting him on his Scottish book tour for his book called Overcoming Zionism. Now, Joel, as everyone will know, I guess, was an anti-Zionist Jew from New York, and I knew him quite well, and hosting him, and of course he wasn't an anti-Semite, he was an anti-Zionist, and that was the beginning of the kind of allegations that somehow I was racist against the Jews because I consorted with anti-Zionists. The worst thing you can possibly do is to consort with anti-Zionists, according to these people. So that was the earliest kind of attack, and those attacks continued. But it wasn't until I arrived at the University of Bristol in 2018 that they really intensified. And maybe if I can just take you through them as quickly as possible. And so after I arrived at the University of Bristol in September 2018, I think it was October, November, when I did a talk for Olive, a Palestinian students group, small private talk for a small number of students. Talking about how they could fight back against the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And of course, what happened was that the Zionists had an infiltrator at the meeting who recorded the sessions, and they then gave the tape to Harry's Place, the well-known Islamophobic hate blog, and they posted online my comments about the need to fight back against Zionism and against the IHRA definition, which was weaponizing anti-Semitism. So that was the earliest indication that they were ramping up a campaign against me, which involved, as I said, an infiltrator, covert infiltrator. And then 3 months later, I gave a lecture on my course, which I'd been given when I arrived at Bristol, called Harms of the Powerful, where we looked at corporate and state power and crimes. And one of the lectures in February of 2019 was on Islamophobia, where I discussed the theories that I developed in my book, my co-edited book called What is Islamophobia, where we discussed what we called the 5 pillars of Islamophobia, where we said, first of all, that the backbone of Islamophobia is the state and the counter-terrorism apparatus, the intelligence services, the police, etc. But that there were other social movements who were engaged in helping to produce Islamophobia in the society and to push it further, to push the state further into more and more authoritarian responses. And amongst those social movements, one of them was the Zionist movement. And so I talked about the Zionist movement for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes in a 2-hour lecture. And then some complaints were made anonymously on behalf of two students who were in the class by an Israel lobby group, the Community Security Trust, and they launched a campaign against me. The complaint was rejected by the university because the CST was not a student. The university gave the students all sorts of guarantees about anonymous complaints, but the students didn't want to make complaints. So the CST recruited another Israel lobby group, the Union of Jewish Students, and had their president write a complaint and managed to get the president of the local Bristol Jewish Student Society to sign on to the complaint. And so that complaint was accepted because that particular student, the president of the Bristol Jewish Society, Nina Friedman was her name, was a student at Bristol, although of course had never been my student, had never taken any sociology classes, and never spoken to anyone who had ever been to any of my classes. I mean, she admitted this in the investigation process. And they took that, they accepted that complaint, which they shouldn't have done. Not least because all of the matters complained of, including statements I had made, 5 years before I had arrived at Bristol, not least because the complaint was out of time, and none of it should have been accepted. Anyhow, it was accepted, and then it was rejected by the person who investigated it, who was the dean of the faculty at the time. Well, that was the first time that I was cleared of anti-Semitism. And the student complained about that, and the university then said, the student complained that the complaint hadn't been taken under the IHRA.
Yeah.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, because the university hadn't adopted that. So the university said to her, she didn't ask for this, but the university said to her, "Oh, well, we're thinking about having the IHRA here, but we haven't debated it yet, and it's going to be a few months yet. So would you like to pause your complaint while we consider whether we change the rules under which the complaint might then be taken?" And she said, "Oh, yes, that would be fine."
Indeed.
And then, of course, she continued as president of the JSOC, along with the other, the Union of Jewish Students, etc., campaigning at the university for the IHRA to be introduced. And indeed, they had a picket outside the meeting later in the year when the university decided to actually adopt the definition and all its examples. Now, the original plan the university had was to adopt a definition, but not with the examples. And as a result of the demonstrations led by the Union of Jewish Students, they changed their mind. They were bounced into accepting the full thing by the Zionist students group, because of course that's what the Bristol Jewish Society is. It's a member of the UJS, which is formally a Zionist organization, as I had been saying for some time.
Yeah.
And so then what happened was that they changed the rules, and then they resurrected the complaint, and they looked at my complaint under the new rules, of course. Total breach of natural justice.
Yeah.
And they appointed a QC, and the QC looked, remember this is during lockdown, looked at the complaint and all the different things that I had said over the years, and concluded that there wasn't a single sentence or clause or punctuation mark which I had ever said which was anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And so so this took from February 2019 to December 2020. And I was cleared and given a full clean bill of health. Never said anything anti-Semitic. No case to answer. Hadn't done anything wrong. And that was that. So it seemed. And then 6 weeks later, I came on a Labour Against the Witch Hunt program.
Yeah.
Thing. And I said, look, I've been attacked and complained about by the head of the JSOC and the head of the Union of Jewish Students, and I didn't name the particular students at the time. I was referring to the organizations. And then all hell breaks loose, and the campaign against me ramps up, and huge numbers of Zionist organizations, more Zionist organizations than most people can count or know names of, wrote in to ask for me to be sacked. I had over 100 MPs and members of the House of Lords call for me to be sacked. There was all sorts of stuff from the Office for Students and from people writing in letters, and there was the creation, one of the best ones was the creation of this new lobby group which appeared and then disappeared, which was called something like, Parents of Jewish Children for Safety of Jewish Students or something like that.
Yeah.
And they made all these complaints. And what happened then was that the university the rules are supposed to be that you, if you complain about a member of staff, either students or staff complain about a member of staff, that there's an investigation. But there were no formal complaints. No. There was a campaign in the press, yes. There were there were questions in the House, etc., but there was no formal complaints. The university took upon itself to do a further investigation, and they appointed the QC again, who looked at my remarks and said not a single thing I'd said was anti-Semitic, or breached equality legislation, or was in any way problematic legally, and they said, "Well, that's very nice, but nevertheless, we're still going to sack you because you've upset some students." So that was the end of that process, and that was in October 2021. I then appealed to the university. They rejected the appeal. I then went to the employment tribunal, which was finally heard in October, from October to December last year, and we're now in the place of waiting for the judgment in that case.
We'll come on to the tribunal in a second, and how that went, because I was privileged to be able to observe some of it, and it was quite astonishing. But just before we go into that, though, Dave, I wonder whether you could say a word or two about how is it that they keep getting away with weaponizing anti-Semitism. I mean, as you say, you've been subject to it for many, many years now. I have many, many victims of around the country. They're even using it, as I was saying in the introduction, to try and close down a criticism of the genocide in Gaza. And yet we've had, Shulamit Aloni, who, I regularly quote, over 20 years ago, saying it's a trick we always use. I mean, a former Israeli government minister on the record saying it's a trick that we always use. And yet this trick, it seems to be being played over and over and again with a great deal of success. How, in God's name, are they able to keep getting away with weaponizing anti-Semitism like this? Although I think the wheels are coming off a little bit with their attempt to weaponize it over the genocide. But, I mean, it has been a very successful tactic for decades. How are they doing it, David?
Well, I mean, that is, I mean, in the end, that's a complicated question. But there are several elements to it, of course. One is that they are consciously organized, and they have spent a lot of time, effort, and money in working out how to do this. Now, one of the key places they've done that from the year 2000 onwards, although they started doing this back in the 70s, I mean, arguably even further than that, which I might talk about. But one of the key ways in which they've done it is they created this thing called the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism. In 2000, it was created by the former Soviet prisoner Anatoly Sharansky, or to give him his Zionized name, Natan Sharansky, who of course became one of the most right-wing Israeli ministers, and there's a lot of competition for that title. And they set this up, and they've had periodic events, conferences in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And that's where they decided how to, and planned how to, confuse people about anti-Zionism and to blur the distinction between it and anti-Semitism. And they're very clear about it. You can go on the internet, on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and on the archives of the conference website, and you can see the different working groups they had. I quite often quote bits of the working groups where they talk about how they're going to do this. And they planned this from the beginning. And so, of course, I mean, just to give you the potted history of how this happened, they at the very beginning, they were able to get what became the IHRA definition adopted or considered by the European Union Monitoring Centre on Xenophobia and Racism, etc., which is an EU body. And it was on their website from 2002 onwards. And then there was some pushback by pro-Palestine activists. And what happened was that the EUMC, eventually declared they hadn't ever formally adopted it, and they removed it from the website when the EUMC became the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is a change in European Union politics. So they had it on there, and they would point to it. They say this is the agreed definition, and then of course the EUMC removed it, and of course they didn't have it. So that panicked them slightly, and of course they had to plan at the Global Forum for what they would do about that. So it comes to the period of 2014 or so, and they're saying, well, obviously what we need to do is we need to find somewhere else to put this definition, and then to have this adopted as the international definition, which we will use as a weapon to combat BDS and the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, etc. And they alight on the idea that what they'll do is they'll have it adopted by the IHRA, and of course they have allies in the IHRA. It's a Zionist front group anyhow, and so they have it adopted. In 2016, I think it is, they're eventually adopted. And of course, that's the weapon of choice which they put into play to combat Corbyn and the left, and etc. And of course, they do it in Germany and they do it in the US.
Yeah.
So that's at the institutional level, that's how they did it. That's how they planned this, right? But the question is, well, why does anyone pay any attention? I mean,
exactly.
If the Saudis were doing this kind of thing, saying, nothing wrong with bone saws if we use them, then people would not accept that, even though the West supports the Saudis and arms them to the teeth and supports them effectively in the appalling attacks on Yemen that we saw over the past number of years.
What MPs used to say to me when I challenged them, David, in the House when I was still an MP, was, well, it was in the national interest to support Saudi Arabia. That's the appalling excuse they give. But anyway.
Yeah, but they don't. I mean, it's more difficult to say that supporting Israel is in the national interest, but they do sort of talk about Israel as being an ally in much more of a sense, the natural ally of the West than they do with the Saudis, because of course the Saudis are Muslims, right? So they've got to have some other account of that. Yeah. So they, I mean, in the end, you've got to ask the question, well, why is it that yes, it's the case that, for example, the United Arab Emirates, an Israeli ally, is able to influence British politics. And we've seen this over the past number of years. In particular, they were able to influence the Cameron government through the threat of removing contracts with BAE and British Petroleum, BP, to implement an investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, and which effectively was an attack on all Muslims. And of course, there are examples like that. And of course, you can see examples where obviously the US is very influential in UK politics, but Israel is stunningly successful in having the policies which are favorable to it passed in the UK, the US, and in many other Western countries. And it appears, if you look at the record, they're more successful than most other countries.
Yeah,
more successful than our allies, than France or Germany. Never mind more successful than, for example, our enemies like Russia or China or Nicaragua or North Korea or Venezuela or whatever. And you've got to ask the question, well, why is that? Is it because they are? I mean, you can think of this in a number of ways. There's a number of different hypotheses you could have. Some of them are racist hypotheses. It's because racist hypotheses like, it's because the Jews are clever and manipulative and all that stuff, right? But now, obviously, that's not the case, right? That's not why this happens. But the other sorts of hypotheses you can have are that it's the lobby, the Israel lobby, i.e., not the Jews but the Zionists and the Israeli government, and that they are successful because they are highly organized and funded, and they're able to influence government policy. And of course, they are highly organized and heavily funded, and you have been cataloging this for several years now. But is it really that they're just more effective lobbyists that's the reason? And I think that's not really. I mean, it explains something, but I don't think it explains everything. And I think that one of the other explanations is the extent to which Zionist Jews are embedded in the power structure of the UK and the US in a way which is out of all proportion to their numerical proportions in the population. And so that's part of the reason, it seems to me, that whenever you have a particular issue, which has the potential to threaten the interests of the Zionist state, that you have people inside the British establishment arguing for Israel's interests.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, is important to see. So when we talk about national interests, quite a lot of the common sense of the political elite in this country is a Zionist common sense. But that's not always been the case. And it's, there have been occasions when it's been perceived by the security establishment, I don't mean the left, I mean the security establishment, that Israel's interests and those of the UK, or indeed of the US, and it's true in the US too, perhaps to a lesser extent, that Israel's interests are inimical to the national interests of the US and the UK. I mean, and let me just give you one or two examples of this, and it allows you to see that there have been, perhaps even still are, somewhere in the obscure pockets of the depths of MI5 or 6 or the Ministry of Defence or something, that there have been people who have been skeptical of the activities of the Zionists and whether their interests and UK interests or US interests are identical. Very, very early on, this was the case. I mean, obviously, it was the case when the Irgun was bombing the British in the King David Hotel, and indeed when both the Irgun and the Stern Gang were conducting operations in the UK, bombing operations, assassinations.
This is pre-Israel being established, isn't it?
Pre-Israel. I mean, the Irgun, I think it was, or was it the Stern Gang? I forget, one of the two of them, claims to have invented the boot bomb when they killed the brother of a British major who they were trying to attack, and they sent a boot bomb disguised in a copy of Shakespeare's plays, which were hollowed out, and they killed his brother by mistake. So there's all that kind of terrorism, which we called terrorism at the time, and everybody recognizes was terrorism.
Yeah.
So that at that point, we were fighting the Zionists, and we understood that they were our enemy. And even after the creation of the State of Israel, that continued to be the case. MI5 discovered a Mossad spy in the Joint Intelligence Organization around 1950, and moved him out. And if you look at the files that are available on the National Archives website, the files say the MI5 officer concludes the case by saying, "Now we understand that Israel is a hostile state."
Yeah,
there we are. MI5 saying Israel is a hostile state, and this view didn't disappear. Let's remember the famous occasion when Margaret Thatcher refused to shake Menachem Begin's hand because he was a terrorist. The occasion when the Zionists, with a Mossad station in London, was involved in the assassination of the Palestinian cartoonist Naji al-Ali.
Just remind us what year that was, David.
1987, I believe.
Yeah.
When Thatcher was in power, of course.
Very recent history, yeah.
Yeah, and Thatcher expelled the entire Mossad station from London as a result. Thatcher did that, and let's remember also that I think it was David Miliband, wasn't it, who expelled Mossad people from London after they used British passports to assassinate a Hamas leader in Dubai, I think. Remember the famous footage from the hotel where the Mossad
yes, indeed,
come up in the tennis gear, go into the guy's room and assassinate him, kill him. They used forged British passports, and that, again, it's not allowed. So they were expelled. So there are times when the British security establishment gets that the Zionists are interests and our interests are not the same. No. And it's the same in the US. And I mean, just one very brief example, the example of Jonathan Pollard, the spy who stole America's nuclear secrets and then was pardoned, I think, by Clinton, wasn't it, right at the end of his presidency? And of course, people now say, well, that must be to do with Epstein, and well, maybe it was. But the point about this is that that there were many people in the security establishment in the US who thought that Clinton should not do this, and that this man was a traitor and he should be in jail. Yeah. And people who you would otherwise think of as being even slightly neoconservative, certainly paleoconservative, old right amongst the Republican hierarchy. So there are times when that can happen, and I suppose that's the point of telling all this in some detail, is to say, well, look, that can happen again. Yeah. It's not just that there are still a tradition of Arabism in the Foreign Office, mild though it might be, but that actually the objective interest might change for them, and they might begin to see that actually if you see Israel as an attack dog in West Asia, that the dog's off the leash. Yeah, and something needs to be done about it. And there clearly will be people in the security establishment who are thinking that now, but
Yeah.
they don't have the whip hand at present.
You've gone into some detail there about how well embedded the Zionists are in powerful establishment entities in that sense, which accounts for, I guess, the way in which the establishment, the government, the media, etc., respond in a positive way to Israel, in a hostile way to critics. But what about others that you'd think ought to know a bit better, really? I mean, I'm thinking of people on the left. I'm thinking about the Corbyn movement and so on, who a lot of them, went along with that. Is it intimidation, in your opinion, or is it something else going on?
Well, I mean, it's obviously intimidation. It's intimidation and bullying, and that's what they do. They just intimidate and bully people, and they think they can get away with it. And quite often they do get away with it. In my case, your case, many other cases we can think of. I mean, I saw people just today quote tweeting Michael Walker from Navarra, who's on criticizing what's happening in Israel, and people underneath saying, but Michael, you were involved in this process, and of course what happened was a whole section of the left. It's not just that they were bullied and that we were bullied and intimidated, and they helped to do the bullying and intimidation, but that they kind of imbibed the philosophy and the ideas and the Zionist ideas. And let's just, I mean, the best example I think really is that the number of people who were expelled from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism in 2017 was 1. Yeah. And then after Jenny Formby takes over and the left has a grip on the party, the number of people who are expelled for anti-Semitism massively escalates. I think 45 in 2019, and perhaps more than that following that. So, of course, the problem there was that the common sense for how to understand this was taken from the Zionists. So the people that Corbyn's office appointed to take on these anti-Semitism cases, which resulted in many more people being expelled for in almost every case dubious charges, was that they imbibed some of the critique which was given to them by the lobby groups. The lobby group which first attacked me in 2019, the Community Security Trust, is a key element here, and this is an extremist organization which supports extremist Zionist groups like Chabad Lubavitch, who we've seen in recent days fighting with the New York police.
Yes,
as some undisclosed tunnels appear under their global headquarters in Brooklyn. I mean, let's be clear, Chabad is a really far extremist organization. They have rabbis fighting with the IDF in Gaza. There are Chabad branches in the UK, more than 100 of them, some of which are openly advertising, raising funds for the genocide. So, I mean, Community Security Trust have been supporting, people behind the Community Security Trust have been supporting Chabad for decades, for more than four decades.
Yeah. So
the CST is providing the bullets for the people inside the Corbyn's offices. Corbyn's office, who are in charge of the anti-Semitism complaints, to fire, and so there are 3 of them. They rather touchingly list all their qualifications in the leaked Labour report, which they wrote. Harry Haywall, Patrick Smith, and Laura Murray, and they talk about how they learned everything they know about left anti-Semitism, which is of course an oxymoron, from Dave Rich of the Community Security Trust, or from that terrible book. Hang on, I've got it here. That's funny. You don't look anti-Semitic, by Steve Cohen, an alleged leftist, and Tony Greenstein still says that he, in his later life, he came to disavow the book, which of course was most recently published by, what's the publisher called? This is an interesting story. I haven't written properly about this yet. By No Pasaran Media, right? A publishing company which takes the slogan of the Spanish Republicans fighting fascism. They shall not pass. I mean, disgracefully. and publishes crap like this, right? And it's run by a guy called John Mendelsohn, who we've of course covered on the show. And Mendelsohn was the
Parliamentary Classified you're referring to there.
Yeah. Classified. And Mendelsohn, of course, was the M in LLM, the New Labour lobbying company, which first mired New Labour in lobbying corruption stories. And he's publishing this allegedly left-wing publishing company. And of course, he collaborates with Conservative Friends of Israel, the head of Conservative Friends of Israel. They have a pro-Israel lobby group on the Abraham Accords. And it shows you, in a way, the way in which the Zionists organize. So that on the one hand, you have this notionally left-wing stuff, and then you have right-wing Zionists, and they all work together on common interests. And the common interest is on defending the ethno-state of Israel and defending genocide. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but the whole point of this is that the Zionist ideas infected the very core of the Corbyn leadership office, and that was a problem. It wasn't just that we were bullied and intimidated, we were, but that they had been won over by these ideas. Yeah, and part of the reason for that is that Corbyn had never been an anti-Zionist, really. I mean, he'd always been in favour of the two-state solution, and he hung around with people on the Jewish left who sometimes claim to be anti-Zionist, people like David Rosenberg, the Jewish Socialist Group, people like that, who actually have a very soft position on Zionism. And that, in the end, is what did for the Labour Party. It was that they sort of imbibed these ideas which were soft on Zionism and were not properly anti-Zionist, and didn't properly understand that actually Zionism is irreducibly a racist ideology, cannot be dealt with, cannot be negotiated with, simply has to be dismantled and abolished. And there's no other way of saying that. And of course, that's anathema to parts of the left as well. And that's partly why I've been excoriated by elements of the left, by the SWP, by the Jewish Voice for Labour, etc., and because they don't understand Zionism. And the reason they don't understand Zionism is because in their ranks are people who are soft on Zionism, who come from that tradition, sometimes from the Bund tradition even, which is anti-Zionist, but which, in the end, these people, Jewish Socialist Group, for example, is not anti-Zionist, it's soft on Zionism, and that's the problem. We have to understand that there is no compromise, that the people on the left who are, sorry to go on about this, but the people on the left who are socialist Zionists, and they say, oh, well, there's always been a tradition in Zionism to have a way of making a deal with the Palestinians, to have a binational state, and it's only because Zionism has been taken in a particular direction that there are bad bits to it. And actually, that simply isn't true. I mean, I got criticised by, for example, Justin Schlossberg, who I've written with in the past.
Yes, I knew it. Yeah. News for Labour, I think he was collaborated with you, didn't he, on that book? Yeah,
that's right. And he said, "Well, it's not true, and you misunderstand Zionism." In 1942, the Zionists, the socialist Zionists, believed that there should be a binational state, etc., etc. So I had a look, as you do when you're criticised on factual points, and of course, it was the case that there was a minority position at the Biltmore Conference in 1942 from the leftist Workers of Zion organization, Hashomer Hatzair. That's the furthest left Zionist sect, which believed in a binational state, and that was a position they managed to hold for 3 years until 1945, and then they fell in with the ethnic cleansers and were enthusiastic participants in the ethnic cleansing in 47, 48, as David Ben-Gurion pointed out, and indeed as the
first Israeli Prime Minister, of course.
Yes, and indeed as the founder of the British Socialist Workers' Party also pointed out. Tony, what's his name?
Yeah, I can't recall myself actually. But,
his name.
We're getting old, David. His name's there.
Oh, it's terrible. So and of course he had been his original name was Egil Gluckstein, Tony Cliff. Sorry, and Tony, of course, and his then to not yet wife Cheney Rosenberg. Cheney had been on one of the Hashomer Hatzair kibbutzim And that's why they broke with Zionism. And
Yeah.
Cliff wrote this amazing stuff on left Zionism in 46, 47,
Yeah.
all of it just fantastically apposite for today. And what happened then was that, of course, that the Hashomer Hesea kibbutzim were involved in the ethnic cleansing, and the closest they got to a progressive position was to say, oh well, yes, the Arabs can have their own kibbutzim, right? They can have, and you're like, I'm sorry, they can have their own kibbutzim. You want Bantustans for the Palestinians, and that in the end, of course, would be what it was, because there couldn't be non-Jews who are members of kibbutz.
No, indeed.
Couldn't happen. And there you see it from at the very, very base of the most furthest left Zionist sect, racism. And of course, this is the same Zionist sect that Tony Benn spent VED on a kibbutzim, where he was there as the Nazis surrendered, where Noam Chomsky, of course, spent time, and where famously as well, Bernie Sanders also spent time on Hashomer Hesea kibbutzim. And that's why there's on the left, there's a misunderstanding about Zionism, is that large sections of the left are soft on either soft on Zionism or Zionist. And
there were many leading left-wing figures in the 40s and 50s who were very supportive of Israel. You know, people like Ian Mercado, Eric Heffer, Tony Benn, and various others. But so I want to kind of get on to your tribunal and the basis of your case about anti-Zionism being a protected characteristic. Just before we get into that, in conclusion, and to sort of finish up our discussion today, you've mentioned the Community Security Trust a few times. You mentioned them in your opening remarks. You've referred to them again there, and they crop up quite a lot, don't they? And I think what a lot of people will be surprised to learn is that they are recipients of substantial funding from the British government, aren't they? And also are closely linked to the Israeli security services, aren't they? Mossad. Just say briefly a word or two about the funding from the government, and indeed the links with the Mossad as well.
Yeah, so the CST set up in 1994, comes out of a series of previous bodies, the Group Relations Educational Trust, and going right back to the 1940s, actually, the various anti-fascist groups set up by returning Jewish servicemen and by members of the Communist Party, which, as we discovered when we looked at this some time ago, that these are heralded as the sort of progenitors of the whole British anti-fascist and anti-racist movement, as brave Jewish fighters against fascism. And of course, there's some element of truth in that, because they did fight fascists on the streets in the 40s and 60s. But what I discovered when I looked back at this, because there was a BBC drama serial called Ridley Road, which looked at these organizations, was that in 1948, the organization which was fighting fascists on the street decided that it would affiliate to another organization. And that organization was the Irgun, the revisionist, Zionist, far-right terrorist organization. And indeed, this anti-fascist group sent tens of people over to Palestine to participate in the Nakba. And that contradiction at the heart of anti-fascism, I think, has never been properly understood in this country. And the people who were in that organization and its successor organization were people who went on to set up the Community Security Trust. The Director of Intelligence, the Director of Intelligence for the 62 group, as it was called, in 1962, was a guy called Jerry Gable, who went on to set up Searchlight, which collaborated directly with MI5 and the Special Branch, and indeed with Mossad. And the head of the finance for the 62 group was a guy called Gerald Ronson, who went on to form the Group Relations Educational Trust and then the CST. Of course, the CST has been very closely allied with and linked to the Mossad, not just in terms of the training which Mossad apparently gives their volunteers, but in terms of their involvement in the development of the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the 1980s, which at that stage was a responsibility of the Mossad, and the CST were a core part of that, of the previous organisation were core part of that process, where they collaborated with the Mossad, and this is well known. And so this is an organisation which exists to run point, as I've put it before, for the Israeli government. And of course, what it does then is that it targets people on the left, Muslims, who are critical of British foreign policy and want to stand up for the Palestinians, and tries to undermine them in their public positions. So that's the function of the CST. And of course, it's been very strongly, I mean, one of its charitable objects in the most recent revision of its charitable objects, it says it opposes extremism. But, at the same time, when we, on the Palestine Declassified, we reported on Chabad for the first time, they put out this briefing saying that we were threatening a Jewish religious group and we were racist, etc. But actually, Chabad is an extremist group.
Yeah, of course.
As I mentioned already, and I could say much more about it, which we haven't got time for just now. But they're there to defend an extremist group, the CSD, and so that's it's a fundamental breach of their own charitable principles, and charity commission should be looking at that, and perhaps they will in the current context.
And I think there should be more said about. Not today, because we haven't got the time. About the fact that the government is actually, throwing money at this outfit. And,
Sorry, I should have gone to talk about that. Yes, I mean, let me say very briefly. So yes, the government has been throwing money at the CST for some time, but I discovered recently, and I haven't written about this yet, but that various millions, multi-millions of the money which they got from the Home Office, they had money from other government departments too, but from the Home Office, came from a part of the Home Office called the Office for Security and Counterterrorism. Now, people may or may not know this, but that's an intelligence agency.
Yeah, of course.
So the CST has been funded by British intelligence for some years, and that, people don't understand that. People don't really know about that, and that's an extraordinary thing as well. And I suppose that the point I would make about that empirical finding is to say, well, there's a strong intertwining between British counter-terrorism, counter-extremism activity, and Zionist priorities. So, and it's not just evident in relation to the CSD, but in relation to a whole series of other Zionist groups which are funded directly by the British government. In a way which similar Muslim groups are simply not. So I think that's an indication of the difficulties of actually pushing through pro-Palestinian politics, is that actually these organizations are core funded by the British government itself. Yeah.
Well, let's just then, in conclusion, David, get on to your employment. Your employment tribunal, which took, I think, about 2 years, didn't it, to actually get to a hearing. Just say a word or two, will you? How you feel the tribunal went, and the basis of your appeal, and what you're hoping to get out of it, as it were.
Well, there's two things. One is that I was wanting to establish that the university had wrongly sacked me, that the process which they used to investigate me was flawed, the process that they used to evaluate the investigation and then decide if I should be sacked or have some other lesser punishment or not have any punishment, that was flawed as well. And in evidence in the tribunal, the university's witnesses more or less admitted that their processes were flawed. So given that, one would anticipate that the judge might come to the conclusion that they shouldn't have dismissed me. We don't know if that's going to happen or not, but obviously we'll have to wait to see the judgment. So that's one thing. And of course, I want to show that I was wrongly dismissed.
Of course.
And the second thing, of course, there's three things, isn't there? The second thing is that I wanted to show that I have been in no way racist against anybody. And in fact, I'm an anti-racist. And of course, the two QC's reports that the university commissioned showed that. The university refused to tell anyone that was the case, and have shown no willingness whatsoever to tell the truth about what happened in their investigations. And so that's the second thing. And the third thing, of course, and this is the most important thing, is the argument that I'm making, that I was dismissed not for, as the university formally said in the letter, I think 57 pages letter, which they dismissed me with, that I had drawn students into some conflict and this was bad and students had been upset. But that actually, the reason that they dismissed me was because I had anti-Zionist views, and I was manifesting those views in the critiques that I made of Zionism. That's the key question which we hope to establish. And if we establish that, we would establish that anti-Zionist views should be protected under the Equality Act, and that people cannot be sacked for having anti-Zionist views, for manifesting them, unless there are additional considerations like the way in which they were manifested were somehow abusive, or which, of course, in my case, was absolutely not the case. So that's what we hope to establish, and that would establish a principle where in the UK it would be very, very difficult to sack anti-Zionists for their views. And in the end, in the case, I mean, the university's witnesses accepted really that it was the fact that I was an anti-Zionist which made my views so repellent to the university, and that I think is it was encouraging to see that evidence. We have to see, of course, how the judge will interpret that. But that's the hope. The hope is that we can establish that as a principle, and that's why we've been fighting this case. And of course, as you know, such a case like this takes a lot of resources.
Yes,
I mean, a lot of money in legal fees. Legal fees don't come cheap.
I'll ask you that, David, because I mean, clearly, this is a really important, it's a sort of test case, really, because I mean, it's not just about you, as important as that is, because you've been absolutely terribly wronged, and you should have justice. I mean, I think they should offer reinstatement, actually, but I suspect they won't do that. But you should certainly be compensated. But it's not just about you. I mean, and if we can get this principle established that, opposition to Zionism, which is, a settler colonial racist ideology, which is being manifested now in a genocide in Gaza, this will, as you've just said, protect other people who have been, and you're not the only one, who has been targeted in this way and who's lost employment. And this will protect others, and indeed may give some relief potentially to other people who, previously been wronged in their employment. So it is a crucially important case, but it is incredibly expensive. Legal fees, as we know, are they don't come cheap, and you don't get legal aid, do you, for this case? And it'd run up a huge bill. And it's therefore essential, I think, that we widen as much as we possibly can, the donor base, as it were. So, just say a word or two, if you can, David, about how people can contribute to the legal costs that you've incurred. Because, as I've said, you won't get your cost back. Even if you win, unlike in my case when I went to the High Court against the Labour Party, costs were awarded against the Labour Party. The Labour Party then had to stump up, getting on for £100,000 for my legal costs. You don't have that benefit, and you may get some compensation, but you won't actually get any recompense, will you, for the costs that you've incurred for your lawyers? And I have to say, lawyers, as I've already said, don't come cheap. And your lawyers are bloody brilliant. I sat in on most of those days, and they were just mustard. So, they were well worth the money, but we've got to find the money. So how can people contribute, David, to your legal fund?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if I win, I might get compensated. I'll get some kind of compensation for lost earnings. I mean, it won't actually compensate me for what I've lost, but there'll be some kind of compensation for that. But in terms of legal fees, no, you can't get any of the legal fees covered, and that's the amazing thing about this. I mean, which people who have not gone through this process, I guess, may not understand. So, I mean, how you can contribute is you can go to the website of the Left Legal Fighting Fund, which is fightingfund.org. And you can donate any amount, small, large would be great, but if any amount helps. Hopefully we can reach a target to cover the legal fees. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with this judgment. I mean, if it goes for us, it's possible the university will appeal. So we may need, to continue fighting if they do that. And so, yes, it's really important that we seek to establish this principle. And if we establish it, and if we win, they appeal, and we will need to keep fighting to defend the principle. But at present, we are at the stage of needing to cover the bills that we have, and I would if anyone can find any way to raise resources, that would be extremely helpful to us, and hopefully to establishing the principle that anti-Zionists cannot be sacked for being anti-Zionists.
Absolutely, absolutely. Listen, thanks very much indeed, David. It's been a really interesting discussion. I hope our viewers have found it illuminating. I think there's a lot of information that you've imparted there that people will, not have been aware of, and so it's been a really, useful learning exercise as well. You can tell you were a teacher, an academic who was used to sort of imparting complicated information in an accessible way. Just finally then, David, how can people follow your work? You've told us how they can contribute to the fund, but you're active on social media. You also run an organisation called Spinwatch, etc. Yeah. Tell us a bit about how people can follow your work.
Well, I mean, the key thing is obviously on Twitter. I mean, we saw yesterday, didn't we, that large numbers of pro-Palestine accounts with large following numbers had been suspended. I think all of them, certainly some of them, are now back on Twitter with some kind of letter from Twitter saying, "Oh yeah, you're back, but no apology." So obviously, given that Twitter or X is under threat, that's a problem. But nevertheless, obviously, the best place is present is on Twitter. I'm there as tracking_power. I guess people can find me there. What I'm also doing now is putting all of my back catalogue of work on Substack, so you can search for Tracking Power on Substack and you'll find me there. And I write quite a lot of stuff I have a column reasonably regularly on My ID in English. I write for Press TV's website. I'm on Electronic Intifada. I'm in Press, and also now on TRT, the Turkish website. But I'm going to be putting all this stuff on Substack, and you can find all the stuff there. The stuff that I was talking about, with the exception of those things which I've said I haven't written about yet. All of these things are in articles, and which you'll be able to find on Substack. So the stuff about Ridley Road and the anti-fascist movement, the stuff about Chabad, and all those things are either on my Substack website or on our show Palestine Declassified, which you can again follow on Twitter or X, or also on Rumble. And the full shows are all available on Rumble, and we post clips regularly every week from the show, so people can follow stuff there as well.
Great stuff, great. Well, listen, I hope you've enjoyed today. Thank you very much indeed, David, for your contribution. David Miller is a gold mine of information. So if you don't already follow him, please make sure you do, because you won't be disappointed. Loads of really, really useful and illuminating information. Thanks for watching. We hope to be back next week at the same time. So until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.
Bye-bye.